Hi everyone, I hope you guys are doing good. So as a part of our Python tutorial series, in last lecture we learned about Python decorator. Now in this lecture we will learn about Python exception handling. Okay, so without wasting time, let's start. So this is the script which I have prepared to demo you guys about Python exception handling. Okay, so first we will understand difference between the syntax error and the exception. Okay. So to understand that, let me just copy this declaration and let me just paste it in idle shell. Okay. So we define the variable like this, right? So we assign the value like this into a variable, right? But what if I'll do like this, okay, and then do enter, right? So it is giving me a syntax error, right? So invalid syntax, right? So syntax is the error which comes while defining the anonymous block or a Python function or any Python file, right? So anytime any error which comes while defining any object body is called syntax error, right? While the exceptions are the runtime error. Okay, so while defining, it will not give you any error. Okay, the error it will throw is while execution of the code. Okay, so let's check that. So this is the variable. I'm defining it here. Okay, so x is the variable and I'm assigning example as a value, right? Let me do enter. Okay, so variable is defined. Now I'm calling a print statement and I'm adding 5 in that variable x. Okay, so I'm trying to add a number into a string type of variable. Let's see what exception it gives, right? So it is print x plus 5. I have written right enter, right? So it is giving me an exception, and exception name is type error, and the message it is giving can only concatenate string to string, right? It cannot concatenate integer to a string. It can only concatenate string to a string, right? So this is the exception and this is the exception message, right? So in an anonymous block, we saw how the exceptions are raised, right? So I'm calling the print statement, and when I'm doing the addition of number in that string variable, then the exception has been thrown out, and by default, the exception message get printed in the console, right? Now, so this was the example in the anonymous block code, right? Let's check the same example in a function, right? So I'm defining a my function called myfunc, and I'm passing an argument called x, and the same logic I'm doing, I'm just adding the plus 5 in the argument which is passed and then printing the output in using print statement, right? So let me define this function first. So my function is got defined, right? Let me just do enter, enter. Okay, so my function got defined. Now let's call this function myfunc, and I'm passing the string as an in argument to this function. Okay, so let's see what happens when we try to add a number to a string, right? So again, it is giving me same error, right? Type error, same exception, type error, and same message, right? So exception can be thrown out from the anonymous block as well as from any Python code, right? So these are two examples, right? Just to demo you guys like how exception has been thrown out by default and message or exception message gets printed out in the console, right? Now, if I don't want that exception to be printed in the console or exception to be given as an output, I want to handle that exception, right? So handling of exception in block code first we'll see, right? So in block code, we can handle the exceptions, right? And the syntax is you can use try and except block. Okay, so in try block you do all your execution, and in except block you write the any message or anything, any action point which will be done when exception will be thrown out by your code. Okay, so let's try this example. Let me just declare this variable first. Okay, so x equals to example, right? Variable got declared, right? Now let me just paste this try and except block. Okay, so this is my code where I'm doing in try, I'm adding plus 5, right, in the x has the value example, and in exception block I'm giving a message that cannot add number to a string, right? Enter, enter, right? So you can see the output is can't add number to a string, right? So in anonymous block, you can handle exceptions using except block, right? Try and except block. So in try, you write whatever you have to do, the action points, and if there is any exception, so it will the control will be passed to the except block, and it will do whatever you will write in your except block, right? So that's how we handle exception handling in anonymous block. Let's check same thing in the function. Okay, so this is my function, right? So in function block also I can write try and except block, right? Similar to the anonymous block. So I'm taking an argument called x in my function, and then in try block I'm doing x equals to x plus 5, right? So I'm incrementing x by 5, right? And then printing the output of x, right? And if there is any exception, it will come in exception block, and then it will print this message can't add number to string, right? So let me just define this function first, and then we'll call this function. Okay, so let me just paste it here, enter, enter. So my function got defined, right? And my function has try and except block, right? So now I'm calling this function and I'm passing a string as an argument. Okay, so let me just paste it here. So this is my function and I'm passing example as an input, right? And here in try block, we are doing x equals to x plus 5, right? That means adding 5 in this string variable, enter, right? So obviously it is going in the exception block, right? And it is printing this message can't add number to the string, right? So this is the example how we can handle exceptions, right? How you can add try and except block and handle exceptions in a function, in a Python function. Okay, now, exception handling with printing exception error name and exception error message, right? So here the exception has been no raised, but we are printing the user defined message, right? Now, what if I want to print the exact exception name and the exception error message, right? To do that, you have to do, right? So in the first line, you can see in the exception block, I have taken exception. This is the syntax. So using except keyword, you can do exception as ex, right? So I'm taking exception in this ex variable, and then I'm printing the name of the exception, right? So to do the syntax is type, take the exception variable ex in that bracket, and then dot dot, then dot, and then this name attribute, right? So it will print the name of the exception which is raised, and to print the message, just print the ex variable, right? So this is the syntax to take the exception which is being raised and print that exception. Okay, so let's try this one. Okay, so let me just copy this code and define this function. Okay, so now this is my function which has an argument as x. In try block, I'm doing same thing, just x equals to x plus 5. And in except block, I'm taking the exception as ex variable, and then printing using the ex variable, printing the name of the exception and also printing the message in the exception. Okay, so let me do enter, enter, right? Now let's call this function, right? So let me call this function. I'll be calling my function and passing my example as an argument, right? So let me just paste it here, enter, enter, right? So you can see can't add number to string. This is the user defined message which I have added in my print statement, right? When exception is raised, and in second line I'm printing the name of the exception, right? So name of the exception is type error, right? So it is giving name of the exception, and third line I'm printing the exception message, right? So exception messages can only concatenate a string, not integer to string, right? So that's how you can get the exception which has been raised, right? And print that exception, right? Okay. Next example is exception handling with multiple exception. Okay. So what if your code has multiple exceptions, right? So if your code can have multiple exceptions, your code can be bigger, right? And it can raise a multiple exception at different places, right? So now, since I know this exception x equals to x plus 5, this exception, this is raising an exception called type error, right? Now I already know the name. So what I can do in the except block, I can write except type error, the exception name, and then in when this exception type error is raised, then print this statement, right? And for any other exception, right? For any other exception, I will just print the exception name and the exception message, right? So for that, I have again written except exception as ex, right? So taking the any other exception into this ex variable, and then printing the name of that exception and printing the exception message, right? So in case of multiple exception, you can handle the exception when you already know the name, right? Using named exception, right? And whatever exception you don't know that which exception is going to occur, right? Then you can use this exception, except exception as ex, right? This kind of, and print that exception name and exception message, right? And okay, so let's try this example first. Okay, so let me just copy this and let me just paste it here. Okay, enter, enter. Okay, so my function got defined, right? So let's call this function, right? So let me just call this function as same my example, right? Let me just paste it here, enter, right? So it is giving me can't add number to string, right? So it is giving me this message, right? Because this type error exception has been raised, right? So whenever type error exception will be raised, it will be printing this message, right? For any other exception, it will print this message, right? So how to check that for any other exception, right? Let's change the code little bit. Let me do like x equals to x divide by 0. Okay, so x divide by 0, let's do that. Okay, so I'm passing an argument and I'm dividing that argument by 0 and then assigning it to x, right? So let's see what exception it is going to raise. Okay, so let me just copy this and let me just again define this exception, define this function, enter, enter. Okay, my function got defined, right? Now let's call my func, right, with a variable called 5. Okay, so I'm passing an argument as 5, right? So it will divide 5 by 0, right? That will give an exception and it will go in any other exception block, right? So let's do that, enter, right? So it is coming in this exception block, right? And because zero division error has been raised, right? That exception, right? So it is first it is printing the user defined message, there might be some other error, and then it is giving the exception name zero division error, and then printing the message division by 0, right? This is the message of that exception, right? So that's how we can handle multiple exceptions in a block, in try block, right? Try except block, right? Now we'll see exception handling with try, except, else, and finally. Okay, so while doing exception handling, we have try and except block, which is mandatory, right? And then these else and finally blocks are optional. Okay, so try block, we already know that we execute all our all our logics in that try block, right? All our code in that try block. If there is any exception, then it will go to the this exception block, right? But there is a else which is optional, we can add. Else is when if there is no exception, right? Then this else part will be done, right? And then there is a finally part, right? So finally will always be executed. Okay, so even if it will execute try, even if there is exception, then also finally will be raised. If there is no exception, it will come in else part, but it will also execute finally, right? So finally will be executed every time. Okay, else will be executed when there is no exception, right? If it will not go in exception block, it will go in else block after try block. Okay, so this is the syntax of try, except, else, and finally, right? So let me define this function first. Okay, so let me copy this function and let me just paste it here. Okay, so you can see in try block I'm doing x equals to x plus 5 in my function, right? I'm not printing x values here, final output x value here, that I'm doing in else part, right? So I'm just doing x equals to x plus 5 and I'm printing the value of x in else part. If there is any exception, it will go in exception block, else it will come here, right? And then finally block, it will come, right? So let me enter, enter. Okay. Now let's call this function, right? So let's call this function first by a number. Okay. So let's call this function and I'm passing 1 as a number, right? So it should give 1, 5 plus 1, right? 6, right? So let me do enter, right? So it is giving me output as 6, right? So where the output is coming from here, print x, right? So it is going in else block, right? And it is also going in mandatory block, right? Mandatory execution, the message I have given in the finally block, which is getting printed, right? In case of successful run of the function, right? Let's try the the exception block, right? So to raise the exception, let's give it as a string as an input to this function. So let me just paste it here. Okay, enter, right? So obviously it is going in exception block, right? So it is going in type error block and it is printing this message, can't add number to string, right? This message is coming, and then it is going to the finally block, right? So it is skipping the else block, right? Since it has been gone in the exception block, right? So it will not go in else block, it will actually go in finally block, right? So finally block will always be executed, right? So now it is printing mandatory execution, right? So this is in case of exception, right? So now you understood, right, like what is the flow of the exception handling in Python, right? So we have try, except, right? If there is any exception, so try will execute our code. If there is an exception, it will go in exception block. If there is no exception, it will go in else block, and then finally block will always be executed. Anything happens in the try block, doesn't matter. Okay. So I hope you guys understood the concept of exception handling in Python, right? In the next lecture, we'll extend this knowledge and learn about the custom exception handlings. Okay. So I hope you guys like this lecture. If you guys like this lecture, please subscribe my channel. Thank you guys.